I was in my early 20s when I decided to embark on a solo backpacking trip through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. Having grown up in urban environments, I yearned for solitude and a deeper connection with nature. Equipped with a reliable backpack, a sturdy sleeping bag, and essential supplies, I set out on a week-long journey along a lesser-known trail that promised both challenge and serenity. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I reveled in the solitude, setting up camp each night under the canopy of towering trees, lulled to sleep by the gentle whispers of the forest. On the fourth day, I ventured deeper into the wilderness, following a narrow path that meandered alongside a crystal-clear stream. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp wood. As dusk approached, I found a small clearing near the stream to set up camp. The spot was idyllic, with soft moss underfoot and a natural barrier of shrubs providing some shelter. After a simple meal of dehydrated stew and a cup of herbal tea, I settled into my sleeping bag, the sounds of the forest lulling me into a peaceful slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke with a start. The forest was eerily silent, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds. A faint rustling reached my ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping underfoot. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, trying to determine the source of the disturbance. I reached for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Scanning the perimeter of my camp, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, a peculiar sensation washed over me, a feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Deciding that sleep was out of the question, I sat up, wrapping my blanket tightly around me. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the darkness, ears attuned to every sound. Eventually, the forest seemed to return to its normal rhythm, and exhaustion took over. I drifted back to sleep, albeit fitfully. The next morning, I awoke to find subtle signs that something had indeed been near my camp. Fresh footprints, larger than any animal I could identify, were imprinted in the soft earth around my sleeping area. They circled my camp, never crossing into it. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that someone, or something, had been watching me as I slept. Determined to put distance between myself and whatever had visited during the night, I packed up quickly and resumed my hike. The trail became more rugged, the forest denser. As the day progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, I found another clearing to set up camp, this time choosing a spot with a clear view of the surrounding area. I built a small fire, hoping its light would offer some comfort. Sleep came reluctantly, and I kept my flashlight within arm's reach. In the early hours of the morning, I was awakened by a low growl. My eyes snapped open, and I reached for my flashlight, its beam revealing a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the edge of the clearing. A large wolf stood there, its gaze fixed on me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, from the opposite side of the clearing, another figure emerged. A bear, massive and imposing. Two seemed to be watching me. Panic surged through me as I realized I was caught between two apex predators. But then, something unexpected happened. The wolf turned its head toward the bear and let out a series of sharp barks. The bear huffed, then slowly retreated into the forest. The wolf lingered a moment longer, its eyes meeting mine, before it too disappeared into the shadows. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just occurred. It was as if the wolf had been protecting me. The thought seemed absurd, but I couldn't deny the sequence of events. The remainder of my journey was uneventful, and I eventually returned to civilization. But the experience stayed with me. I often reflect on that night, pondering the mysteries of the wild and the inexplicable events that can occur when we venture into nature's domain. I did a long hike through the Great Dividing Range one summer when I was in my early 20s. It was the kind of trip I had wanted to do for a while. Off the grid, no phones, no cars humming by, no lights except the stars. It was just me and a couple of mates, but we all split off at night and camped separately. We figured it would add a little solitude to the trip and let us enjoy the peace in our own way. We weren't carrying full tents, just sleeping bags and light tent flies in case of sudden weather. It was Australia in summer, hot and dry, and we wanted to go as light as we could. The days were stunning. Long hikes through dry forest and scrub, crossing ridgelines that overlooked valleys so wide and green they looked like paintings. The sky always felt close and endless at the same time, the kind of blue you only get far away from city haze. Kangaroos scattered when we got too close, and cockatoos screamed from the tops of old gum trees. The air smelled of eucalyptus and dust. By the 6th or 7th day, we were deep in it. No towns nearby, no roads, barely a track underfoot. Just footpaths worn in by other hikers or old bushwalkers over time. We were careful about water, always made sure we topped off at creeks when we came across them and boiled or filtered everything. Food was just trail mix, dried stuff, and the occasional protein bar. No fire. Too risky in the dry heat. That night, we found a clearing just off a slow bend in the trail, a little higher up the ridge. The ground was flat and dry, scattered with leaf litter, and just enough of a break in the trees to see the stars once the sun went down. The slope dropped off about 20 meters past the clearing into thicker bush, and if you pushed through it, you'd hit a small dry creek bed. We'd come across it on the way in. I picked a spot under a low-hanging tree that offered some shade and just enough space for me to stretch out in my bag. The others were spaced a few hundred meters away, out of sight but within whistling distance. I rolled out my sleeping bag, stuffed my backpack under the lower end to prop up my feet a bit, and took in the view as the sun started to dip. That orange-pink glow crawled across the bush like a slow tide, setting the tops of the trees on fire with color. Birds were calling out their last sounds of the day. Cicadas were already starting their chorus. It was peaceful, but it changed not long after the sun went down. I started noticing little shapes moving on the edge of my vision. Nothing unusual at first. Bugs, ants, little things you always expect to be crawling around in the dirt. But then I felt something tickle the edge of my hand as I was lying on my side, just starting to drift. I brushed it away, thinking it was a beetle or something, but then it happened again. On my neck this time, then again on my face. I sat up and ran my hands over my face, brushing away whatever was there. I couldn't see anything at first, but then I switched on my headlamp and looked around. The ground was alive. Caterpillars, fuzzy, hairy ones, hundreds of them, all moving in slow, strange coordination across the leaf litter. They were everywhere. I don't know if they had been burrowed under the leaves during the day or had just moved in after dark, but they were thick now, crawling up tree trunks, over my gear, onto my sleeping bag. A few had already made it into the folds of the bag itself. They weren't aggressive or anything, just there, crawling over everything in slow waves. At first, I just sat there, staring. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to yell out to the others and look like a fool. Plus, we were all dealing with our own things out there. That was part of the point of the trip. But this was different. I'd never seen anything like it before. It wasn't just the numbers, it was the way they moved. Like the ground was shifting. I tried to shake out the bag and clear the area around where I was lying. I figured maybe if I made enough movement, they'd scatter. I stomped around a bit, waved my hands, flicked some away with a stick, but they just kept coming. Slowly, persistently, I ended up lying back down on the sleeping bag and pulling my arms in tight, zipping it up as far as I could go and cinching the top around my head. My face was the only thing exposed. I figured if I stayed still, they wouldn't crawl on me. I was wrong. I felt them all night, one after another, tickling their way across my face, sometimes stopping near my mouth or eyes. I'd swat one off and two more would take its place a few minutes later. Sometimes I'd get a break, 5, maybe 10 minutes of nothing, and I'd start to relax, start to drift off, and then it would start again. That crawling, feather-light touch of their legs on my skin. My skin started to itch. I didn't know if it was in my head or if they were leaving tiny hairs behind that made me react, but it felt like everything was crawling. My neck, my cheeks, even the insides of my ears. Once, I woke up gagging because I jerked in my sleep and felt something near my mouth. I don't know if I inhaled one or not. I hope not. By 3 in the morning, I gave up on sleep. I sat upright, headlamp dimmed to save the battery, just watching them move. I saw one fall from a branch and land near my knee. Another climbed up a rock beside me and then just sat there, antennae moving slowly in the night breeze. It was almost hypnotic in a way. So many of them, just going about whatever business caterpillars have. But I couldn't relax, couldn't even close my eyes. My breathing got tight a few times. Not a panic attack exactly, but close. My heart would race and I'd have to sit still, focus on the trees above, and remind myself that it was just insects, just part of being in the bush. They weren't dangerous. They weren't going to bite or sting or hurt me, but that didn't matter. When you're that exposed, that alone, and they keep touching your face over and over, something deep in your brain starts to go off. Like a switch. It's not rational. It's just fear. I thought about moving, about packing up and trying to find another spot. But there was nowhere else flat nearby that wasn't covered in the same stuff. And stumbling around the bush at night in the dark isn't smart. You can twist an ankle, walk off a ledge, walk into a nest of something worse. So I stayed put. I think I might have drifted off around dawn. Just a few minutes at a time, in that weird half-sleep where you know you're not really resting. I remember hearing the first birds starting to sing. That's usually a peaceful sound. But this time it felt like the longest night of my life was finally ending. By full light, I looked around and saw the ground still covered, but they were starting to thin out. A few were climbing trees, disappearing into the undergrowth, finding places to hide from the sun. I stood up slowly, stretching out sore joints, brushing off anything still clinging to me. My skin was red and blotchy in places. I was tired, itchy, and deeply uncomfortable. When I packed up my gear, I found 3 of them inside the sleeping bag lining. Another one was tangled in my socks. I shook everything out twice. I still don't know how many I missed. When I met back up with the others, I didn't say much. We were all tired. I think they could tell I'd had a rough night, but they didn't ask. And I didn't offer. There was something about it I didn't want to put into words. It wasn't a dramatic story. Nothing chased me. Nothing screamed in the dark. But it stuck with me. Still does. That was the only night of the trip that really rattled me. The rest of the hike went fine. We saw more wildlife, had close calls with snakes, ran low on water once or twice, but nothing ever got under my skin the way that night did. Literally and mentally, I still hike, still camp out under the stars when I can. But I always bring a full tent now, even if the weather's clear, even if it adds weight. And every time I lie down in the bush, I check the ground twice, sometimes 3 times, just in case. I was in my early 20s when I decided to spend a night in the redwood forest in Northern California. Back then, I was broke. Not just student loan broke or still living at home broke, but scrounging for change to buy instant noodles kind of broke. I didn't own much gear, and most of what I had was either borrowed or salvaged from thrift stores. But I had a car that ran, some free time, and a hunger to see something bigger than the 4 walls of the cheap apartment I was crashing in at the time. I figured a few nights in the woods would be good for my head. I drove north alone, hugging the coast, and eventually made my way to one of the redwood parks. I can't remember now which one it was exactly, maybe Humboldt, maybe Jedediah Smith. All I know is it was dense, quiet, and far enough from any town that the sky looked endless when the stars came out. I didn't have a tent with me, just a large wool blanket I'd picked up from a surplus store, a sleeping bag, and some extra sheets and clothes stuffed into a garbage bag. I found a spot not far from a trailhead that led off into thicker woods, parked the car where it wouldn't be in anyone's way, and wandered a few hundred yards into the trees before picking a place to settle in. I wasn't too deep into the woods. I was cautious enough to stay near a trail and within a reasonable walk of the car, but it was far enough that I felt like I was truly alone. The spot I chose had soft, mossy ground and some flat space under a stand of redwoods. The trees were impossibly tall, and the way the canopy filtered the late afternoon light made everything feel muted and still. I laid the wool blanket down and unrolled my sleeping bag on top of it, layering some extra fabric under me to block out the damp. It wasn't fancy or smart or even particularly clean, but it felt good to be outside, away from people and noise and responsibilities. It got cold fast when the sun dropped. Even in the summer, those woods held onto their chill. I ate a simple dinner, something canned and cold, and washed it down with water that had gone warm sitting in the car. Then I just lay there, curled up in the sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. Distant branches creaked and groaned high above. Leaves rustled with the occasional breeze. Every now and then, I'd hear something skitter or crunch in the undergrowth, but I tried not to let it get to me. I knew there were raccoons, maybe foxes or deer out here, but nothing I needed to worry about if I kept to myself. Eventually, I dozed off, my breath condensing faintly in front of my face, the sleeping bag pulled up tight under my chin. I don't know what time it was when I woke up again. The forest was pitch black around me. My eyes took a while to adjust, and everything was coated in that thick, quiet darkness you only really get far from cities. The canopy above let almost no moonlight through, and I had to fumble around for my flashlight in the mess of clothes and bags near my head. When I finally got it turned on, I didn't expect anything unusual. Maybe a raccoon nosing around, or just some half-awake paranoia after hearing a random sound. What I saw instead made my stomach tighten and my skin crawl. All around the edge of the blanket, right at the perimeter, almost forming a loose ring, were these long-legged black spiders. Not just one or two, dozens. They stood like sentries, their legs thin and spindly and jointed in unnatural-looking angles, each one spaced out from the next but close enough to form an unbroken circle. Their bodies were small and their legs made them look bigger than they were, but there were so many. Some were just standing still, legs stretched outward. Others twitched slightly, shifting or adjusting, but none of them made a move toward me. They were just there, still, surrounding the blanket, like they were waiting for something. For a long minute, I didn't move. I just lay there under the sleeping bag, holding the flashlight still, watching these things poised around me. I had no clue how long they'd been there. Maybe they'd wandered in over the course of the night. Maybe they'd been watching me sleep for hours. The idea that I'd been unconscious while these things crept into place, close but not quite touching me, sent a deep shiver through me that wasn't just from the cold. They didn't scatter when I moved the light. They didn't crawl closer either. They just stayed put, forming this eerie, twitching border between me and the forest floor. I could see the way the light reflected off their bodies, matte black with tiny hints of brown or gray, and the faint gleam off their legs as they shifted or raised a limb slowly before setting it back down. I tried to breathe slowly, to keep calm, but every tickle or itch under the blanket felt like it might be another spider that had already gotten inside. I felt phantom touches on my neck and wrists and ankles, and everyone made my heart kick into overdrive. I pulled the sleeping bag up tighter and tucked the fabric in all around me. I wasn't sure what else to do. It wasn't like I could leap up and run away without stepping right through them. And I sure as hell wasn't going to swipe at them and risk getting bit, or having a bunch of them panic and run across my body. The rational part of me tried to focus on the fact that they weren't attacking. They weren't even reacting much. They were probably waiting for bugs or something drawn to body heat. Maybe the warmth of my breath or the residual heat from the sleeping bag had attracted them. Maybe the blanket had picked up something sweet or damp from the ground that was drawing them in. It didn't matter. I wasn't moving until the sun came up. So I lay there, flashlight off to conserve the batteries, heart thudding, wrapped tight in layers of wool and synthetic insulation. I tried to sleep, but every time I felt the faintest sensation on my skin, I jolted back into alertness. I must have drifted off at some point because I remember waking up again to dim light bleeding through the trees. It was early morning. The canopy was still thick, but enough sun had pushed through to light the clearing around me. I cautiously pulled the sleeping bag down from my face and slowly sat up. The spiders were gone. Not one remained around the edge of the blanket. I looked carefully, scanned the moss, the bark, the folds of the fabric, but there wasn't a single trace of them. It was like they'd never been there at all. Just empty forest floor, dew-damp and silent, with only a few leaves and twigs scattered where they'd been. I stood up slowly, stretching out my back and legs. My body was sore from lying tense all night, and I had the stale, unpleasant feeling of not having truly rested. My fingers were stiff and cold, and I rubbed them together as I looked around the clearing. The morning was quiet, peaceful even. Birds were chirping somewhere high above, and the smell of wet leaves and pine sap filled the air. But the peacefulness didn't sink in. Not really. I spent the rest of the morning packing up my things in silence. Every time I picked up a blanket or shook out a piece of clothing, I did it carefully, half expecting something to scurry out. I didn't see another spider, but the memory of the night before clung to me. I rolled up the wool blanket, stuffed the sleeping bag into its sack, and made my way back to the trailhead. I didn't stay another night in the forest. That was the last time I ever went camping without a tent. I saved up and bought a proper one a few months later, one with a zipped inner mesh layer that nothing could crawl through. Even after I had the gear and the money to do things the right way, I never really got over that night. I'd still go into the woods, still hike and sleep under the stars sometimes, but I always felt a little less at ease, especially once it got dark. You can tell yourself all you want that it's just bugs, just spiders, just nature being nature. But there's something different about being alone, exposed, and surrounded by creatures that don't follow your rules or care about your presence. That night reminded me that no matter how peaceful the woods might seem, there's a whole world of things out there that move quietly in the dark, watching, waiting, doing what they do, whether you're ready for it or not. A few years back, my brother and I decided to do a short backpacking trip in Colorado. It was late summer, that window in the Rockies when the weather can still be warm during the day but the nights are already starting to turn cold. We both had a few days off, and we figured it was a good time to get out for a couple nights. Nothing too remote, just a moderate trail that led to some high mountain meadows with lakes where we could camp, cook some simple meals, and unwind. The trailhead wasn't far from where my brother lived at the time, and the route was familiar to him. I had hiked parts of it before but never camped overnight there. We packed light, just the essentials: tent, stove, freeze-dried meals, bear canister, first aid kit, and our usual layers for the fluctuating temperatures. My brother brought his headlamp and a folding knife, and I had my compact flashlight, an emergency whistle, and my sleeping pad strapped tightly to the bottom of my pack. We were trying to keep things minimal but still covered for the basics. We set out around mid-morning, starting on a trail that snaked through pine and spruce, gradually gaining elevation as it cut through rocky ridges and dropped into small valleys. The elevation gain wasn't too intense, but enough to get the blood moving. We didn't see many people that first day, just a couple groups headed back down. It was quiet otherwise. The sky was clear, though some faint cloud lines were forming way off in the distance behind the ridges. By the time we reached our planned camp area, we were above 10,000 feet, and the temperature was already starting to dip even though the sun was still out. There was a decent patch of flat ground near a cluster of willows and spruce trees, with a bit of a slope running down to a creek. You couldn't hear the water unless the wind shifted just right, but it was close enough to refill our bottles and filter what we needed for cooking. We pitched the tent a little ways back from the tree line to avoid deadfall, though honestly there weren't any huge snags around. Mostly scrubby evergreens and those tall, thin trunks that groan a little when the breeze cuts through them. Once the tent was set and our food locked in the bear canister a good 75 feet away, we just sat for a while, watching the shadow line creep up the western ridge. It was peaceful, that kind of deep quiet you only get in the backcountry. Just the occasional creak of branches and that dry rustling of leaves that comes when the wind glides across them. After we ate, we settled in. It got cold fast. The stars were out in force, clear and sharp overhead, and the air was crisp enough that I could see my breath before ducking into the tent. I remember drifting off pretty quickly, body tired from the hike and the thin air, my face cold where it wasn't tucked into my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when my brother nudged me awake. I was groggy and didn't process what he was saying right away, but he wasn't being loud or frantic, just urgent in a quiet kind of way. He had his headlamp on, pointing low to the ground inside the tent, and I could tell from his face that something wasn't right. Then I heard it, a snap, like a twig, somewhere close. Not loud like a branch falling, but the kind of snap that happens when something steps the wrong way just once, followed by silence. the kind of silence that settles thick. We both just sat there, breathing shallow, trying to pick out any more sounds. He reached for the tent zipper and moved it down slowly, trying not to make too much noise. We both had our headlamps on now, and once the door was open, we pointed the beams out across the clearing and into the willows that edged the creek. That's when we saw them. Eyes, huge, shining back at us through the dense brush. Motionless. Just two big orbs reflecting the light right back at us from maybe 25 or 30 feet away. No sound, no shifting, no visible outline of a body. Just the eyes, locked on us, unblinking. My brain immediately went to bear. It made sense. This was bear country, and the elevation wasn't high enough to rule them out. We'd followed proper precautions, food stored away, no scent stuff in the tent, but nothing is ever foolproof out there. We kept our lights on the eyes for minutes. I counted them in my head, not fast. Real-time minutes, with the beams flickering just slightly in the misty air. The eyes never moved. Not a shuffle, not a step forward or back. Just constant, fixed staring. I remember feeling something strange about how still it was. Most animals shift. They look, then they blink or move their heads slightly. This didn't. It just watched. I whispered, not loudly, that we should probably start moving slowly, maybe get to one of the nearby camp clusters we saw on the way in. There were other people maybe half a mile back. It wouldn't take long if we moved quick and didn't run. We turned off the headlamps, thinking that whatever it was might lose interest. Maybe it was just curious, maybe it would back off once it didn't see the light. But almost the moment we turned them off, we heard the crash. Not a snap. A full-out crash of branches and brush exploding outward. Something huge coming out of the willows fast. There was no time to even register a reaction. I froze, but my body tensed instinctively, ready to move. The shape came barreling through the trees, massive, thundering toward our tent. But just as fast as it appeared, it veered, hard. It didn't stop. It curved wide and crashed off again into the opposite tree line. A moose. I caught just enough of its outline in the fading moonlight. Long legs, tall shoulder hump, broad body, massive. It hadn't made a sound until it broke the cover. That was the eerie part. I don't know if it had been standing there the whole time or just watching from the side, but it had waited. After it disappeared, we didn't speak. We just grabbed our headlamps, kept them off, and moved. Left the tent as is, took only what we needed, knife, flashlight, a jacket, and started hiking back toward the last spot we'd seen campers. We found them after maybe 25 minutes of hiking in silence. A couple of tents dimly glowing in the dark. We camped not far off the trail nearby. Didn't even sleep much that night. A few months later, back home and back into my routine, something else happened that still sits with me. I hiked this one local trail near my place a lot. Nothing too wild, just a forest loop that climbs a ridge and cuts back down along a stream. Maybe 4 miles total, a bit muddy after rain, but manageable. I bring my dog most of the time, a lean mixed breed with a lot of energy. She knows the trail by heart. One day we were out during a break in the weather. It had rained earlier that morning, and most people stayed in, so the trail was empty. I didn't mind. The air was cool, fresh, and I liked the silence after rain. We were maybe halfway in when my dog, who had been trotting ahead like usual, maybe 15 to 20 yards out, stopped dead in her tracks. No growl, no bark, just a hard stop. Full body stillness, like she was carved in place. Then, without warning, she turned and bolted. Full speed, not playful running, not chasing anything, just straight up panic. She ran right past me, almost knocked into my legs, and didn't even pause when I called out. She wasn't just retreating, she was fleeing. I didn't hesitate. I turned and followed, heart already pounding, something in my gut telling me this wasn't normal. As I moved, I glanced down near the trail where she'd stopped. It wasn't clear at first, but then I saw it. A single print, deep, fresh, no claw marks, but wide and round, padded. I've seen enough to know what I was looking at. Mountain lion. It had rained a few hours earlier, and the mud was soft enough to leave sharp outlines. This print was clean, edges distinct, and it was fresh. very fresh, no other tracks around it, just that one visible spot like it had stepped out from somewhere off trail and watched us for a moment. I didn't look for more prints. I didn't call out. I just kept running, following my dog's lead, both of us knowing instinctively to put distance between us and that spot. I didn't see the lion. That's the worst part. You don't see them, not until they want you to. When I got back to the car, my dog was already there, pacing and panting. She didn't settle down until we were well on the road. And even then, she kept looking out the back window, like something might still be trailing us. I didn't hike that trail alone for a long time after that. I didn't stop hiking altogether. I love the outdoors too much to give it up, but it reminded me of something I already knew but maybe didn't fully accept until then. The wilderness isn't yours just because you walk through it. It's shared space, and sometimes the other occupants aren't interested in sharing. Both of those experiences left a mark. The moose reminded me how fast things can go from quiet to dangerous without a second of warning. The mountain lion taught me that silence doesn't mean safety, and that animals don't announce themselves, they calculate. Nature doesn't have to be loud to be terrifying. Sometimes, it's the stillness, the waiting, the moments when your gut says something's wrong but your eyes haven't caught up yet. I still camp, I still hike, but I pack a little smarter now. I listen more, I pay attention when my dog acts off, and I trust my instincts in ways I didn't before. Out there, instincts matter more than anything. I was in my late 20s when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Sierra Nevada mountains. Having spent most of my life in bustling cities, I yearned for solitude and a deeper connection with nature. Equipped with a reliable backpack, a sturdy sleeping bag, and essential supplies, I set out on a week-long journey along a lesser-known trail that promised both challenge and serenity. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the rhythmic crunch of leaves underfoot, the distant calls of birds, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I reveled in the solitude, setting up camp each night under the canopy of towering trees, lulled to sleep by the gentle whispers of the forest. On the fourth day, I ventured deeper into the wilderness, following a narrow path that meandered alongside a crystal-clear stream. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and damp wood. As dusk approached, I found a large, flat rock protruding from the forest floor. It was an ideal spot to rest, elevated, dry, and offering a clear view of the surrounding area. After a simple meal of dehydrated stew and a cup of herbal tea, I settled into my sleeping bag atop the rock, the sounds of the forest lulling me into a peaceful slumber. Sometime in the middle of the night, I awoke with a start. The forest was eerily silent, devoid of the usual nocturnal sounds. A faint rustling reached my ears, followed by the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping underfoot. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, trying to determine the source of the disturbance. I reached for my flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. Scanning the perimeter of my camp, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. However, a peculiar sensation washed over me, a feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Deciding that sleep was out of the question, I sat up, wrapping my blanket tightly around me. Minutes felt like hours as I sat in the darkness, ears attuned to every sound. Eventually, the forest seemed to return to its normal rhythm, and exhaustion took over. I drifted back to sleep, albeit fitfully. The next morning, I awoke to find subtle signs that something had indeed been near my camp. Fresh footprints, larger than any animal I could identify, were imprinted in the soft earth around my sleeping area. They circled my camp, never crossing into it. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that someone, or something, had been watching me as I slept. Determined to put distance between myself and whatever had visited during the night, I packed up quickly and resumed my hike. The trail became more rugged, the forest denser. As the day progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Occasionally, I would catch glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. That night, I found another clearing to set up camp, this time choosing a spot with a clear view of the surrounding area. I built a small fire, hoping its light would offer some comfort. Sleep came reluctantly, and I kept my flashlight within arm's reach. In the early hours of the morning, I was awakened by a low growl. My eyes snapped open, and I reached for my flashlight, its beam revealing a pair of glowing eyes just beyond the edge of the clearing. A large wolf stood there, its gaze fixed on me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. Suddenly, from the opposite side of the clearing, another figure emerged. A bear, massive and imposing. Two seemed to be watching me. Panic surged through me as I realized I was caught between two apex predators. But then, something unexpected happened. The wolf turned its head toward the bear and let out a series of sharp barks. The bear huffed, then slowly retreated into the forest. The wolf lingered a moment longer, its eyes meeting mine, before it too disappeared into the shadows. I sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just occurred. It was as if the wolf had been protecting me. The thought seemed absurd, but I couldn't deny the sequence of events. The remainder of my journey was uneventful, and I eventually returned to civilization. But the experience stayed with me. I often reflect on that night, pondering the mysteries of the wild and the inexplicable events that can occur when we venture into nature's domain. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. Work had been eating away at me lately. Too many hours behind a screen, too little time outdoors. So when I finally managed to carve out a long weekend, I didn't waste any time planning a solo hike and overnight at Sleeping Giant Provincial Park in Ontario. I'd seen pictures of the place before, the way the land jutted out into Lake Superior like a man lying down, his silhouette giving the park its name. It looked remote enough to feel like a proper escape, but not so wild that I'd be completely out of reach. I arrived in the afternoon, the sun low enough to throw long shadows from the trees as I parked my car at the trailhead. The first stretch of the hike was uphill and quiet. I could hear the wind pushing through the trees and the occasional birdsong, but otherwise it was just the sound of my boots crunching over fallen leaves and gravel. Felt good. My body was sweating, but my mind was starting to slow down, which is exactly what I'd needed. The trail led me through a mix of thick forest and open stretches that offered views of the lake far below. I saw a couple of other hikers on the way in, but after the first hour I was completely alone. I'd chosen a small clearing just above a gentle slope that led down to a pebble beach. The trees were dense at my back, but in front of me the land dropped away to the lake. It felt like the kind of spot you read about in camping books. I pitched my little one-man tent just as the sun dipped behind the treetops. There was still a faint orange glow on the water, and I stood for a while just watching it shift and shimmer. The smell of pine and cold fresh water filled the air. That first night is always the hardest for me. Something about being alone in the woods strips away the sense of comfort I usually carry around without even thinking. During the day I can handle it, but when the sun drops and everything gets quiet, or worse, loud with animal sounds, I start to feel the edges of fear creeping in. It's not that I don't trust myself. I've done solo trips before, but out here you don't get second chances. If something goes wrong, you can't just call someone. You're it. You're the only one who knows where you are, the only one who can fix whatever problem pops up. That weight sits differently once the light fades. After eating some jerky and a handful of nuts, I climbed into the tent and lay there listening. The woods are never quiet, really. Twigs crack, leaves rustle. Something always moves out there, even if it's just the wind shifting a branch. But your brain, especially when you're alone and in a place that feels unfamiliar, starts to twist those noises. A falling pine cone becomes a footstep. A scratching branch becomes a claw. It's hard to stop your mind from making those leaps, and that night mine was leaping like crazy. I kept telling myself it was just wildlife. The area had black bears, but they were usually shy. More of a raccoon or deer vibe out here. But that didn't make it easier to sleep. I lay there staring up at the roof of the tent, my flashlight beside me, fully awake. Every so often I'd shift in my sleeping bag, trying to find a more comfortable position. I couldn't get used to the sounds. The forest felt too alive, like it was pulsing around me. Around midnight, maybe later, I didn't have my watch on. I heard a sharp crack, Not like a twig bending in the wind, but a clean break. Something had stepped on a branch and snapped it underfoot. My heart thudded hard and fast. I stopped breathing for a second just to listen more closely. Then I heard it again, a slower crunch like weight on leaves or gravel. It was coming from the tree line behind me. My tent was set with the opening facing downhill, toward the slope and the beach, and the forest behind me was thick. Too thick to see through, even in daylight. Now it was just blackness back there. I lay still. I didn't want to make any sound. My ears were straining to pick up more detail, but the forest felt like it had swallowed itself whole.
No crickets.
No wind. Nothing. Just that soft crunch, then another. Then silence again. My hands were sweating. My body was frozen, but every nerve felt like it was sparking. My thoughts kept circling the same pattern. Someone's out there. I tried to reason with myself. It's probably a deer, or a raccoon, or something else harmless. But the footsteps sounded too heavy. Not deliberate like a person walking, but not light either. Just controlled. Like whatever it was knew it was close to something and didn't want to make noise. I reached over slowly and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't switch it on yet. I just held it, breathing shallow, waiting. Then I heard it again. A crash, this time from in front of me. It sounded like something falling, like a set of rocks getting dislodged and tumbling. Came from down the slope. My eyes flew to the front of the tent, but I couldn't see anything in the dark. I clicked on the flashlight. The beam shook in my hand, casting a narrow cone of light on the tent fabric before I unzipped the door and pointed it outside. For a moment, all I saw were trees and the silvery shapes of rocks. Then I saw it, just past the edge of the light, down the slope maybe 15 feet, an elk, tall, clumsy, shaking its head like it had just stood up, was standing on the rocky beach. It looked confused, maybe a little scraped up, but alive. It must have come through the woods and lost its footing on the slope, tumbling down to the waterline. I watched it stand there for a while. It didn't move much, just sort of stood still like it was trying to gather itself. After a couple minutes, it ambled off to the left, disappearing into the trees along the shore. My heart was still racing. I couldn't stop thinking about the noise before that, the sound of footsteps behind the tent. It didn't make sense. Had the elk circled around me? Or was that something else? I stayed up the rest of the night, too wired to sleep. I sat with my back to the tree line, flashlight beside me, knife in my hand. Not that it would have done much. Morning came slow, and when the light started to fill the forest, I stepped out to look around. I walked up toward the tree line and then down the slope to the beach. There were signs of the elk's tumble. Disturbed leaves, scraped bark, a few hoof prints, but nothing that explained the earlier footsteps behind my tent. Still, it was possible that it had come from that direction before sliding down. That's what I told myself anyway. I packed up early. I didn't feel like sticking around another night. The trail back was quiet again, but this time I felt more exposed than free. I couldn't stop checking over my shoulder. Every sound in the forest pulled at my nerves. I made it back to my car by mid-afternoon and sat behind the wheel with the doors locked for a good 5 minutes before I started it up. I was trying to make sense of the fear. Nothing had happened, technically, but something about being that alone, that vulnerable in the dark, made it feel like something could have. Like I had stood right on the edge of a bad situation and stepped back just in time. Looking back now, I know the fear I felt was real, even if the threat might not have been. Maybe it was just an elk. Maybe it came in from behind me and I spooked myself. But that sick gut feeling I had, that something was too close, too quiet, too careful. I've never been able to explain it away completely. I haven't camped solo since that trip. Not because I don't want to, but because I don't trust that edge anymore. It's thin out there, thinner than I realized. And sometimes, when the woods go quiet, I still hear that one clean twig snap in my head, and I wonder if I was really ever alone at all. I've always enjoyed solo camping. Something about being completely alone in the woods, with no cell signal, no background noise, no expectations, just me and the quiet. I never went too far off the beaten path, not because I was scared, but because I liked having the option to hike out if something didn't feel right. Still, I always chose the more isolated campsites, ones that didn't get much traffic, especially during the shoulder seasons when families and groups weren't around. That weekend was one of those trips. It was early fall, and the trees were just starting to turn. I had driven out to a state forest I'd been to a few times before. It had miles of trail and a handful of primitive sites you could hike into. I picked one I'd been to before, Site 17, about 3.5 miles in. It sat back a bit from the river and was shielded by thick trees. No vehicle access, no toilets, just a fire ring, a flat spot for a tent, and a bare pole. It was my kind of place. The hike in was uneventful. I didn't see a single person after leaving the parking lot. Just squirrels darting across the trail and the occasional rustle of something deeper in the woods. Felt normal, calm. I got to camp mid-afternoon, set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and cooked a basic meal. Boiled rice and dried veggies, the kind of thing I always bring. I spent the evening sitting by the fire, sipping instant coffee, and watching the sun go down through the gaps in the trees. When it got dark, I put everything that smelled into a bag and hung it high on the bare pole, then climbed into my tent and read a bit by headlamp before falling asleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The fire had burned out, and the tent was pitch black. No moon. I wasn't startled awake, just kind of alert. I lay there listening. The forest had that thick silence that makes your ears ring. I couldn't hear wind, bugs, anything. That was what struck me as odd. Usually, even at night, there's something: crickets, frogs, leaves rustling. But this was still, like a held breath. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not a deer crashing through brush. Not something running. Just slow, careful steps. Crunching leaves one at a time. They weren't close, probably 30, 40 yards off. But they were definitely there. And definitely human. I could tell by the rhythm. I lay there, not moving, just listening. Whoever it was circling. I could hear the steps shift position, pausing, then starting again. They were keeping distance but making a full loop. I didn't have a weapon, just a hatchet for splitting wood and a decent knife I kept clipped to my pack. Both were outside, next to the bare pole where I had left my cooking gear. My pack was hung high up there too, out of reach of animals. I had nothing in the tent but my sleeping bag, water bottle, and flashlight. My boots were outside the vestibule flap. I stayed still for maybe 15 minutes. The footsteps would stop, then start again. It was like whoever it was knew where I was but wasn't in a rush. They were just watching. Eventually, I reached over and slowly unzipped the flap, just enough to peek out. I didn't shine my light. My eyes had adjusted, and I could make out basic shapes in the dark. Trees, the faint outline of my fire ring, and across the clearing, movement. It was a man. I could see just enough to know that much. He was standing still between two trees, facing my tent. Not moving, not saying anything, just there. His silhouette wasn't bulky, no backpack, no gear that I could see. Just standing with arms loose at his sides. I watched for a while. He didn't come closer, didn't speak, didn't run. Just stood there like he had all night. I thought about yelling, about shining my light, about running. But the part of me that knew better said not to. Something told me that pretending everything was normal, like I hadn't seen him, was safer than acknowledging him. So I quietly zipped the tent back closed and lay down like I was going back to sleep. I kept my hand on my flashlight, just in case. Eventually, the footsteps started again. They circled wider this time, then faded. After a long time, maybe an hour, I heard nothing. Just silence again. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there waiting for the sun. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped out slowly. Everything looked normal. My food bag was still up. No trash scattered. No signs of animals. My boots were where I left them. But I noticed prints, boot prints. Not mine. They were fresher than mine, overlapping some of my trail from the day before. Whoever had been there hadn't imagined it. I packed up quickly. I didn't cook. Just took down the tent, stuffed everything in my pack, and got moving. I hiked the 3.5 miles out without stopping. Didn't hear or see anything on the way back. The parking lot was empty when I got there. My car was the only one. The part that stuck with me the most wasn't that someone was out there. It was that they didn't do anything. They didn't try to rob me, didn't approach, didn't speak. Just watched. Like they were waiting. Like they were thinking. And here's the thing that really unsettled me. When I got home, I started thinking back through everything, replaying it. That guy had no gear, no light, no visible pack. He wasn't out there camping. He wasn't hiking that deep in at that hour with nothing. He wasn't passing through. He came out there for a reason. Maybe he expected that site to be empty. Maybe he was surprised to find someone there. Or maybe he wasn't. Maybe he'd watched me hike in. I'll never know what he wanted. But I know this. If he'd wanted to hurt me, he could have. There was nothing stopping him. I was alone, unarmed, and far from help. I realized later that acting like I didn't see him, pretending nothing was wrong, might have saved me. If I'd confronted him, yelled, or shown fear, maybe things would have gone differently. After that, I stopped solo camping for a while. Not because I was scared of the woods, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't what almost got me. It was the person in them. I still camp now, but I do it differently. I let people know where I'm going. I bring gear I didn't used to. I camp in areas with at least a few others nearby. And I never assume that just because a trail is quiet, I'm alone. Sometimes I think about that night. I picture myself watching someone from the trees the way he did, imagining what kind of person would do that. I still don't have an answer, but I know he wasn't lost. He wasn't confused. He wasn't curious. He had a plan, and something stopped him from going through with it. I don't know what that was. Maybe he changed his mind. Maybe he didn't like how I acted normal, didn't show fear. Maybe he just wanted to scare someone. But every time I think about it, I remember the silence. The way the woods went dead quiet. Like everything else knew something wasn't right. Like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I got lucky. That's the truth of it. Nothing smart I did. Nothing I could have planned for. Just luck. And I know next time I might not be so lucky, because you can prepare for the cold, for rain, for bears, but you can't prepare for someone like that. Someone who doesn't want your wallet or your gear. Someone who just wants to see what happens when the only witness is the trees. And the scariest part? If he had done something, if I hadn't been lucky, they might have never found me. Just another guy who walked into the woods and didn't walk out. That's what stays with me, not what happened. What almost did.